The helicopter blades sliced through the dense forest air, their rhythmic thrum echoing the pounding in his chest. As the soldier stepped onto the soil of his homeland, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. It had been months. Months spent in distant lands where the scent of gunpowder never truly faded, and the faces of fallen comrades haunted his dreams. Now the dust of war clung to him, and the silence of the forest felt almost unnatural. His boots pressed into the soft earth as he walked, his eyes scanning the tree line. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp leaves, a stark contrast to the dry, acrid atmosphere he had grown used to. The distant chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind were soothing in their own way, yet they only amplified the unease within him. The serenity of his surroundings was a far cry from the chaos he had left behind, and the stark contrast made him feel like a stranger in his own land. He had come here for one reason: to heal, to find peace in a place untouched by the violence he had witnessed. But peace remained elusive. Every step felt heavy, as though the weight of his past still clung to him, refusing to let go. Something was missing. The world around him felt muted. The vibrant green of the trees, the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots. These things should have been comforting. Instead, they only deepened his sense of disconnect. The soldier paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line, searching for something he couldn't quite define. He wanted to believe that the peace he sought was out there, just beyond the next hill, hidden in the shadows of the forest. But doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. Had he truly left the war behind, or had it followed him here, manifesting in this uneasy feeling that he was not alone? The deeper he ventured into the woods, the more the trees seemed to close in around him. It was as though the towering forest, in its endless stretch of green, was watching him, waiting for him to lower his guard. He felt as if he were being tested, as if the land itself was challenging him to confront the ghosts of his past. His instincts, sharpened by years of combat, remained on high alert, even in this place of stillness. There was an unspoken tension here, something he couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself it was just the lingering effects of war, a phantom anxiety that would fade with time. But deep down, he knew something was different. The forest was waiting, and soon he would realize that it wasn't just the trees that held secrets. As the soldier pressed on, his thoughts shifted from his unease to the task at hand. He had come here seeking solace, not to be consumed by memories and emotions. He forced himself to focus, one step at a time, deeper into the forest. His body, though weary from his time in service, was still strong and capable, each movement reminding him of the discipline he had left behind. It was in the stillness, the overwhelming quiet, that the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. That's when he heard it, a soft whimper, barely audible, but distinct in the otherwise quiet surroundings. The sound was raw, desperate, and it immediately gripped his attention. His hand instinctively moved toward the rifle slung over his shoulder, but then he stopped himself. This was no battlefield. There were no enemies here, only nature. And yet, that sound felt out of place, out of rhythm with the calm he was trying to find. The soldier's instincts kicked in. Slowly, he crouched low, moving silently through the underbrush, his sharp eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of life. Then just ahead of him, something caught his gaze. Movement. It was small at first, a rustling in the leaves, followed by a low growl that did not belong to any creature he recognized. With his heart racing, he pushed forward, keeping his body low to the ground. The growl grew louder, more distinct, until finally he saw it. A baby bear, no more than a few months old, was limping through the thick forest, clearly struggling. Its fur, once thick and lush, was matted with dirt and blood, and it staggered forward with every step as if it could hardly hold itself up. The soldier's eyes softened as he took in the sight before him. The cub's large amber eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither moved. It was a standoff of sorts, man and beast, both uncertain of the other, yet drawn together by some unspoken understanding. He could see the cub's fear, its trembling body betraying its fragility. The soldier's heart clenched. He had seen suffering on a much grander scale, But there was something about this small, innocent creature that pierced through the hardened armor he had built. It wasn't the kind of fear that could be reasoned with. This was the fear of an animal, helpless and unable to protect itself. The soldier hesitated. In his years of training, he had learned how to handle enemies, how to outwit and outmaneuver those who wished him harm. But this was different. He was face to face with something that didn't want to fight, something that was simply looking for survival. His hand, now steady, reached out slowly. The baby bear, though cautious, didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to allow the soldier to come closer, as though it knew he was no threat. The soldier's breath caught in his throat as he moved closer still, closing the gap between them. He gently extended his arm, making sure to move with care, with purpose. There was no sudden motion, no sharp gestures, just slow, deliberate steps. And then his hand brushed against the cub's fur. The bear flinched at first, its body tensing, but it didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned into his touch, a soft whimper escaping its throat. For a moment, the soldier was frozen, unsure of how to proceed. He had seen plenty of animals in his time, but never one in such a state of need. This wasn't a wild creature he had to defend himself against. This was a creature that needed him. Without thinking, the soldier scooped the cub into his arms. It was light, its small body trembling against him, but its weight didn't feel like a burden. Instead, it felt like something else, something deeper, a connection. The forest around him seemed to quiet in that moment, the rustling leaves becoming distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The baby bear gazed up at him with those large eyes, its trust evident even in its fragile state. And the soldier, despite his exhaustion and the emotional toll of his past, couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. He began to walk, the cub cradled against his chest, feeling the warmth of its small body against his own. The forest, once an eerie place of disconnection, now felt like a place of strange refuge. The soldier couldn't explain why he felt this way, but he knew that the bear, in its own way, was calling to him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel quite so alone. As the soldier trudged through the dense woods, the weight of the baby bear in his arms felt strangely comforting, yet the responsibility it carried began to sink in. The animal, small and fragile, had come to him for help, and he couldn't turn his back on it. The soldier's mind raced with questions. What had happened to this bear? How had it gotten into such a state? And more importantly, why had it found him? The answer didn't come easily. In fact, it seemed to vanish the deeper he wandered into the forest, as though the trees themselves were swallowing his thoughts whole. But the soldier knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just leave the cub here. It was weak, vulnerable, and alone, just like he had been in so many ways. Perhaps this was the universe's way of showing him that he still had a purpose beyond the battlefield. He knew the cub needed more than just shelter. The bloodstains on its fur, the limp in its step, these were signs of injury, signs of something worse. His training had prepared him for many things, but this was different. There was no manual for caring for a wounded animal in the woods. He had no first aid kit, no expert to guide him, but he did have the will to fight, to survive, and that would have to be enough. The soldier found a small clearing up ahead, a quiet, peaceful spot that seemed like the right place to stop. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. He carefully set the cub down on the soft moss, allowing it to rest while he assessed its condition. The bear didn't make a sound, its breathing slow and shallow, as if it too understood the gravity of the situation. It lay still, eyes half-lidded, exhausted. For a long moment, the soldier just watched it. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, but he knew that if the bear was going to survive, he had to act. His fingers brushed the cub's fur, feeling the roughness of its coat and the tender places where it had been injured. There were cuts along its legs, bruises near its ribs, evidence of a struggle, of something it had fought to survive. The soldier's hand lingered on the bear's side, and something stirred deep within him. This small creature had trusted him, and now it was his turn to trust himself. He wasn't in the military anymore. There were no commanders telling him what to do, no rules to follow. In that moment, he understood that his only mission was this: to help this bear, to make sure it had a chance at life. He moved quickly, gathering what he could from the surrounding area: leaves, soft moss, and branches. He used the few remnants of his survival skills to create a makeshift bed, soft and secure. He wasn't sure how long the bear would need to rest, but he knew that the journey to healing, for both of them, would be long. As night fell, the soldier settled beside the cub, staring into the flickering flames of a small campfire. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence, but even it couldn't erase the tension he felt. There was something about the bear that unsettled him. It wasn't just its injuries. There was a strange sense of fate that hung in the air, like some invisible thread connecting him to this creature. Why had it come to him? Why, of all people, had this bear found him in the vastness of the forest? The soldier shifted, gazing down at the cub. It stirred slightly, its eyes meeting his, and for a fleeting moment, the soldier swore he saw something in those eyes, something older, wiser than the innocence of a creature so young. It was a look that seemed to say, "You have no idea what you're about to discover." The soldier shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. It was absurd. The bear was just a bear, lost, scared, and seeking help. That was all. There was no mystery here. But deep down, something told him that this encounter was far from ordinary. He leaned back against a nearby tree, closing his eyes for a moment. The wind had picked up, and the forest seemed to whisper in a language he didn't understand. The soldier felt a shiver run down his spine. He had no answers, only questions. But one thing was clear: he had made a decision, and there was no going back. The night passed quietly. The soldier kept the fire low, just enough to ward off the chill of the forest, and his eyes never strayed far from the baby bear. The cub slept for most of the night, its breathing steady but shallow, the slow rise and fall of its chest almost hypnotic. The soldier sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting, though his mind seemed unwilling to rest. He had helped the bear. He had taken it in, cared for it, and for now that was enough. But even as the fire flickered, there was an unsettled feeling gnawing at him. The morning light filtered through the canopy above, casting soft beams across the forest floor. The soldier awoke to find the cub still resting, though its movements had become more fluid, less stiff. It had begun to recover. The soldier felt a strange pride, as if the healing was a sign that he too was starting to mend. Piece by piece, like the cub. Perhaps this was what he had needed all along. A purpose, a sense of direction beyond the endless war that had once consumed him. But the bear's trust, though comforting, also stirred a lingering doubt. There was something about the markings on its fur, the odd pattern of scars and symbols that appeared almost deliberate. They didn't look like natural wounds, and yet they didn't seem to be the result of human interference either. The soldier had noticed them the moment he picked up the cub, but in the chaos of his decision to help, he had pushed the thought aside. Now, as he watched the bear stir in the soft morning light, the doubts crept back. He leaned in, taking a closer look at the cub. The marks were unmistakable, running along its side like strange etchings. They didn't seem to serve any purpose, at least not one he could decipher. They were too symmetrical, too clean, as if they had been carved or placed with intention. His brow furrowed, and for the first time since finding the bear, the soldier began to feel uneasy again. It was as if the forest itself was watching him, waiting for something to happen. The soldier stood, taking a few steps away from the cub, pacing back and forth. His mind worked feverishly, trying to make sense of it. Was this a sign? Was this cub truly lost, or had it been sent here for a reason? The soldier had spent years following orders, trusting that there was a purpose behind everything. But out here, in the isolation of the forest, there were no orders to follow, only instincts. And right now, those instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong. He had been trained to question, to assess and reassess every situation, to trust his gut when everything else failed. And his gut told him that this was no ordinary encounter, no ordinary bear. There was a story here, one that he wasn't yet ready to understand. The soldier's pulse quickened as he looked back at the cub, still resting peacefully under the shade of the tree. It seemed harmless enough now, but what if this was part of something larger, something he wasn't yet prepared for? His eyes scanned the surrounding woods. The forest, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt more like a trap. He had come here to heal, to escape the world he had left behind, but the deeper he ventured, the more it felt as though the world was closing in on him. The soldier's hand instinctively moved to the small knife at his belt, though he didn't know why. He wasn't afraid of the bear, but the situation had begun to feel less like a chance encounter and more like a calculated move in a game he didn't understand. He crouched beside the cub again, his fingers brushing gently against its fur. The bear let out a soft growl, waking fully from its rest, and looked up at him with those large, intelligent eyes. It was a look that seemed to pierce through the soldier, as though it was aware of his every thought. For a moment, the soldier felt as though the animal was searching him, not just for help, but for something deeper. And in that fleeting instant, he could almost feel the weight of whatever it was the bear had brought with it. The soldier didn't know what he expected to find, but part of him hoped for a sign, something that would give him answers, or at the very least, comfort. But the forest remained silent, and the only sound that filled the air was the rustling of the wind. The marks on the bear's fur remained, an unspoken mystery that seemed to grow heavier by the second. It was then that he noticed something new. Just beyond the clearing, through the thicket of trees, a faint glint caught his eye. It was subtle, but undeniable. An unnatural flash of light reflecting off something metallic. His instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly toward the source of the glint. The bear forgotten for a moment as the soldier pushed through the dense undergrowth. What he found left him breathless. The soldier's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the brush, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The glint of metal was faint, barely visible, but it was enough to lead him deeper into the forest. With every step he took, the unease in his gut intensified. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around him. What had he stumbled upon? He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, an ominous presence hanging in the air. As he neared the source of the reflection, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing hidden in the shadows of the forest. At the center of the space was a large, metallic structure, half buried beneath the earth, covered in moss and vines. It looked old, but not like something of nature. It was something crafted by human hands, something deliberate. The soldier's eyes narrowed as he approached, a growing sense of dread creeping over him. This wasn't just a random discovery. It felt like a piece of a puzzle he wasn't meant to solve, a secret that had been carefully concealed, waiting for someone to uncover it. He circled the structure, his fingers brushing against the cold, rusted surface. The markings that adorned the metal were unmistakable, similar to those on the baby bear's fur. Symbols carefully etched into the surface, symbols that seemed to hold meaning. The soldier didn't know what they meant, but he could sense their importance. It wasn't just the symbols that unsettled him. It was the fact that they seemed familiar, as if they were connected to something from his past. The memories came flooding back in a rush. Memories of a covert operation, a mission shrouded in secrecy, one that had been deemed too dangerous even for the highest ranks. The mission had gone wrong, and the soldier had barely made it out alive. The details had been blurred, filed away in his mind as something to be forgotten. But now, standing before this strange relic, those memories came crashing back with a vengeance. The soldier's pulse quickened. He had never spoken about the mission, never even told anyone the full story. He had left it behind, buried it deep inside. But standing before this metal structure, he couldn't ignore the connection any longer. This wasn't just a random encounter. The bear, the markings, the strange feeling in the air. It all pointed to something far larger than anything he had ever imagined. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The soldier wasn't sure what to do next. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them along the surface of the structure, feeling the grooves of the markings beneath his fingertips. There was no denying it now. This was no ordinary piece of debris. It was a remnant of something much darker, something tied to a part of his life he had tried to forget. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. The rustling of leaves, a faint crunch of twigs beneath weight. The soldier froze, every muscle tensing. Was it an animal, a person, or something else entirely? His instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly, crouching low and retreating into the shadows of the trees. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him. He peered out from behind the trunk of a tree, his eyes scanning the clearing. There, emerging from the trees, was a figure. It was hard to make out at first, but as it stepped into the light, the soldier's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, and its movements were deliberate, controlled. There was something unsettling about the way it moved, something predatory, as if it knew exactly where it was going. The soldier's hand went instinctively to the small knife at his belt, though he knew it wouldn't do much against the figure if it came to a confrontation. But he wasn't sure what else to do. The figure stopped just short of the metallic structure, its eyes scanning the area. It didn't seem to notice the soldier lurking in the shadows, but the soldier's presence hadn't gone unnoticed by the bear. A low growl broke the tension. The baby bear, which the soldier had momentarily forgotten about, was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the figure with eyes full of suspicion. It was no longer the helpless, fragile cub the soldier had found. It stood tall, its posture defensive, ready to protect itself. The soldier's mind raced. Who was this figure? And why was it here? What connection did it have to the strange structure and the markings on the bear? His gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Everything in this moment, every piece of this unfolding story, was part of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. And he was standing at the center of it, unsure if he was ready to face the answers. But the answers, it seemed, were not so easily given. The figure moved closer to the structure, its hand outstretched, as though it knew exactly how to activate something within the metal. The soldier's heart raced. He had to act now, before things escalated beyond his control. He stepped forward, making his presence known. The figure's head snapped toward him, its eyes cold and unblinking, as if it had been expecting him all along. The soldier's grip tightened around the handle of his knife, but he knew he wasn't prepared for whatever was about to unfold. The figure spoke, its voice low, almost a whisper in the wind. The soldier couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and it was clear. The soldier had just uncovered a secret he wasn't meant to find. The soldier's heart raced as the figure's gaze locked onto his. The forest felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, like something was pressing in on him from all sides. The baby bear growled again, this time louder, more forceful, its small body tense with an energy the soldier had not expected. He kept his eyes on the figure, who had yet to make a move, but was now fully aware of his presence. The soldier's grip tightened around the knife, though he knew it wouldn't be enough if it came to a fight. The figure didn't seem to be in a hurry. Instead, it took a step closer to the soldier, slow and deliberate, as though measuring him. The soldier tensed, his senses on high alert. His mind raced. Was this some kind of trap? A test? He had learned long ago that in situations like these, hesitation could cost him everything. But in that moment, the soldier also felt something else. Something that didn't belong. A strange sense of inevitability. Then the figure spoke, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "You found it," it said. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and the soldier didn't move. The figure's eyes were cold, calculating, and the soldier understood in that instant that this person, or whatever it was, knew exactly what it was doing. It knew what the soldier had discovered, and it wasn't surprised. The baby bear let out a soft whimper, stepping slightly forward, but the soldier held up a hand, still watching the figure. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "What does this have to do with me? And why is it here, with me?" He didn't expect an answer, but he needed to ask. The weight of the questions pressing on him had become too much to ignore. The figure tilted its head as though considering the soldier's words, its gaze shifting between him and the bear. "It has everything to do with you," it replied, its tone almost too calm, too certain. "The bear didn't just find you by accident. You were always meant to find it, and it was always meant to find you." The soldier's mind raced, his body still tense, but he could feel the edges of a horrible truth starting to form. He wasn't just here by chance. He wasn't just some random soldier walking through the forest. The baby bear hadn't come looking for help. It had come for him, and it had found him, just as the figure had said. But why? And what did this all mean? Before he could ask another question, the figure stepped forward, and the soldier instinctively raised his knife. The figure stopped, raising a hand in a gesture that was both placating and commanding. "There's no need for that," it said. "We're not your enemies. Not yet." The soldier's breath caught in his throat. Not yet? What kind of threat was this? What did the figure mean by that? The figure's eyes softened, but it was not a look of kindness. It was something else, something deeper, as though the figure was holding back an even darker truth. "You don't understand yet," it continued, "but you will. This bear, these markings, the metal, it's all connected. You're part of something much bigger than you ever imagined. The truth will find you whether you want it to or not." The soldier's pulse quickened. He had been right all along. This wasn't just an innocent encounter in the forest. There was something far more sinister at play. The markings on the bear, the strange metallic structure, it was all a clue, a trail leading him towards something he wasn't prepared to confront. The soldier took a step back, his mind reeling. The figure's words, cryptic and unsettling, left him with more questions than answers. He looked at the bear, still standing firm beside him, its amber eyes meeting his with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. For the first time, he wondered if the bear had been the one guiding him all along, pulling him into this web of mystery. But for what purpose? The figure let out a sigh, as though it had been waiting for the soldier to come to this conclusion. "You have no choice now," it said, its voice filled with a quiet certainty. "You were never meant to walk away from this. The story isn't over yet." A chill ran down the soldier's spine as the figure turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The soldier wanted to follow, to demand answers, but something held him back. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt like a prison. He was trapped in a story he didn't understand, and the more he uncovered, the more it seemed that there was no escaping it. He turned to the bear, its gaze still fixed on him. There was no turning back. The soldier didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same. He had walked into the forest hoping for peace, for healing, but what he had found was something far more dangerous. A secret, a mystery, and a force far greater than anything he had faced before. The bear let out a soft growl, almost as though it was warning him of the path ahead. And though the soldier still had no idea what was to come, he knew that whatever it was, he was no longer alone.